She read the letter so many times the fold lines had gone soft as cloth, and she still didn't know if she was walking toward a home or just a different kind of nowhere. My name's Nora Fenwick, and I was 28 years old the autumn I got off a train at the far end of a rail line that didn't go anywhere after it, in a town called Windle. Carrying one bag I refused to let myself struggle with, no matter how heavy it got. The platform there was 3 planks wide and it faced straight into the west, so if you stepped off in the afternoon, the sun hit you first, before the town even had a chance to. I remember raising my hand against it before I could see a thing. When my eyes adjusted, there wasn't much to see anyway. A livery at one end of the street, a dry goods store with a faded sign, a saloon with a shutter someone had propped open weeks ago and never gotten around to fixing, and a little white church set back off the road at an angle, like whoever staked its foundation had changed his mind halfway through and just kept building anyway. It was a Thursday in late October, and the light was already low and slanted, the kind of light that makes everything look a little more serious than it is. The station agent came out to grab a crate off the freight car and gave me the look people in small towns give strangers, long enough to take in everything about you. Short enough that you're not supposed to notice. Then he went back inside like nothing had happened. I stood there a second longer, picked my bag back up, and walked toward the general store, because that seemed like the kind of place that would know where everyone in town actually was. Behind the counter was a woman with iron gray hair pinned back tight, working through a ledger with a pencil stub, and she didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her face wasn't unfriendly. Just used to strangers who needed one specific thing and then left. "Came in on the train," I said, which wasn't a question, just something to say while I found my nerve. "I'm looking for a man." I pulled the letter out of my coat pocket and read the name off it, even though I knew it by heart. Reading it out loud still felt like it required a decision, every single time. She looked at me, then at the bag by my feet. "Silas Marrow," she said, like she was confirming it to herself. "He's out at the Sutter's Ridge Lot building. Take the west road past the livery, keep on till the cottonwoods thin out." She paused, tapping her pencil once against the counter. "You'd do better to wait here. He'll be back before dark." So I waited. I set my bag by the door out of the way and stood near the front window where I could watch the road. She went back to her ledger. Outside, a boy of about 7 went tearing across the street and vanished between 2 buildings. A dog trotting after him at a pace that suggested it had learned better than to commit to anyone's urgency but its own. Here's the thing nobody tells you about waiting in a town you've never seen for a man you've never met. The light does something strange to you. It moved across the floorboards in a long, brass-colored rectangle while I stood there, and I watched it shorten minute by minute, and I thought about the letter in my pocket. 4 months old by then. 4 months since I'd written back the same day I got it, before I'd let myself think too hard about what I was agreeing to. There was a bench by the door. I didn't sit in it. Standing felt more honest to what I actually was in that moment. A woman who hadn't yet been given a single reason to settle into anything. "There's water in the pitcher if you want it," the storekeeper said, not looking up. "Thank you," I told her, and poured a little into a thick glass, the kind made to survive being dropped rather than to look nice on a shelf. I drank it standing at the window, watching the road bend out of sight behind a stand of scrub oak gone rust-colored with the season. The letter had said 2 bedrooms. It had said the work was steady. And then this line, the one I'd read so many times I could recite it in my sleep. "I'm looking for someone capable and willing." And I'll say plainly that I'm not a difficult man to live beside. Not a promise. Not a single flourish. Just a man giving an honest account of himself and leaving room for me to give one back. I want to tell you, whoever's listening to this, I'd been burned before by men who promised flourishes. This letter was the first one that ever felt like it was actually telling me the truth. And that scared me more than any lie would have. A lot can change in 4 months. I knew that. I wasn't naive about it. I'd traveled a long way on the strength of 11 careful sentences from a man I'd never laid eyes on, and I told myself I'd look at what was actually here, and then I'd decide. That was the only thing I'd ever really been able to do with my life. Show up, look hard, and decide. The light had crept another foot toward the back wall when the storekeeper said, without any drama at all, "That'll be him." A wagon was coming up the main street from the west. One horse, a dark bay, walking steady. The man on the bench held the reins straight-backed, not stiff, just straight, the way a person sits when they've stopped thinking about how they sit years ago. He had sawdust caught in the seams of his jacket. I could see that even before he pulled up. He wrapped the reins, climbed down, and stood a second in the street looking at the storefront like he was bracing for something. Then he came in. I want you to remember that moment, because it's the one everything else in this story hangs off of. I picked up my bag. He stepped through the door and let his eyes adjust from the glare outside to the dim of the store, and his gaze went first to the storekeeper. A small nod. Quick recognition, and then it landed on me. He was taller than I'd pictured from the handwriting. Careful, upright handwriting, like a man who didn't write often and wanted to get it right when he did. The sawdust wasn't just on his jacket, I saw now, it was in his hair along his collar. A working day. He hadn't gone home to clean up before coming to meet me, and I didn't know yet whether that meant something good or something careless. He crossed the floor without hurrying. I stayed put and let him close the distance. When he stopped, there were maybe 3 feet between us, not crowding, not standoffish either. "You made it," he said. "I did," I said back. He looked at me plainly, the way I'd already decided I was going to be honest with myself about, not sizing me up like livestock. Just trying to match the woman standing in front of him to whatever picture he'd built up in his head from 11 sentences and a signature. I let him look. It seemed only fair since I'd been doing the same thing to him for about 4 minutes straight. "Long ride from the junction," he said finally. 6 hours. The second coach had a bad wheel. "They always do," he said, and something about how plainly he said it, no apology for the territory, just a flat acknowledgement that yes. That's simply how it is out here. Loosened something in my chest I hadn't realized was clenched tight. He picked up my trunk without asking. I noticed he checked first that I still had the bag in my hand, that I had something of my own to carry, before he lifted the heavier thing. That small detail stuck to me the way certain small things do, for reasons you can't explain until much later. "I'll tell Mrs. Iverson you came through," the storekeeper said to no one and everyone, the way people in small towns narrate the day back to itself. He held the door. Outside, the shadows off the buildings had stretched long across the street. He set the trunk in the wagon bed, and I climbed up onto the bench without waiting for a hand up. Then it was just the two of us, side by side, the bay standing patient, the reins loose in his fingers. He didn't say anything right away. Neither did I. The horse started walking the second he asked it to, and the town slid past us on either side, the livery, a woman shaking a rug out of an upstairs window. That same boy from earlier now walking instead of running, eating something out of his fist. "House is about a mile out," he said after a while. "All right," I said, and that was the whole conversation. But I want you to sit with me a second in that silence because it wasn't an empty one. There's a kind of quiet between two people who don't know each other yet that feels like holding your breath. And there's another kind that feels like the first honest thing either of you has offered the other. That ride out of Wendell was the second kind, though I couldn't have told you that at the time. I only knew it later, looking back, the way you always understand a beginning after you've already lived most of the middle. The road opened up ahead of us in that late gold light, packed dirt hardened by a long, dry summer, holding the wagon steady without complaint. Grass ran flat and pale on either side, all the way out to the tree line, mostly cottonwoods, and behind them the sky had already started its slow slide into amber at the edges. I saw the house before he pointed at it. Low-shouldered, half-old wood gone silver-gray with weather and half-new lumber still bright with fresh planing, like the building itself hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be when it grew up. A porch ran across the front with a single step. A lean, to stood off to the side, tools I couldn't name hung along the outer wall in a neat row. "Porch steps loose," he said as we turned onto the track. "I know about it," I didn't answer. That's the kind of thing a person says when what they actually mean is something else entirely, and they're not ready to say that yet either. Here's where I have to tell you, because if I don't say it now, you'll spend the whole rest of this wondering. I had no idea. Standing in that yard with my trunk in his arms and the sky going purple behind the ridge, just how much that half-finished house was going to end up teaching me about a man's character. or how much it was going to end up teaching me about my own. Inside, the front room held a table, 2 chairs, a cold cast-iron stove, and a west-facing window catching the last of the direct light. The floor had been swept, but not recently, the kind of swept that's become a permanent condition of the room rather than a chore anybody still does on purpose. There was a second door, closed. "That room's yours," he said, nodding at it. "I sleep in the addition." I opened the door, small. A cot, a north-facing window that wasn't catching any light this time of day. A hook on the wall, an empty shelf above the cot. The room had that particular coolness of a space that's been sitting empty long enough to grow its own weather. I set my bag on the cot and went back out. "I'll start supper," I told him. He looked at me once, not long, nothing I could read off it. And then he stepped carefully over that loose porch board on his way out and crossed the yard toward the lean-to. I've learned more about the men I've lived with from their kitchens than from almost anything they've ever said to me directly. I found the matches beside the stove. Flour in a tin near the window, salt in a little clay pot next to it, a half-side of bacon hanging from a ceiling hook, dried beans in a burlap sack that would need more time than I had before dark. I cut the bacon instead and found a cast-iron pan seasoned down to black glass. While it rendered, I took inventory the way you do when you're trying to learn a stranger through his belongings. A wash basin, 2 plain plates on a shelf, both clean, 1 cup with a hairline crack running from rim to base, and a second cup without a single mark on it. A dish towel folded over the oven handle, folded precisely, not the fold of a man who thought about such things, but the fold of a man who'd done it exactly the same way so many times it had simply become the way it was done, without him ever deciding it should be. I sliced what was left of a 2-day loaf wrapped in cloth, cut away nothing. It was fine. He came in when the smell reached the yard. I heard him pause on the porch at that loose step, then his boots on the floor. He washed his hands at the basin without being asked. I set his plate down and sat across with my own, and we ate without talking, the wind moving through a gap in the eaves with a sound that was almost a whistle and never quite got there. The lamp burned low and amber between us. He ate the way men eat who have been eating alone a long while, not fast, not slow, just completely unaware anyone was watching him do it. I was watching. Not with anything I would have put a name to yet. Just cataloging, the way you do in a strange place, sorting out what was fixed from what could still move. When he finished, he set his fork down and studied the plate before he looked up. "It's good," he said. I let the words sit there a second before I moved past them. "Bread'll be better tomorrow if I make a fresh loaf, if there's flour enough." "More in the lean-to," he said. I nodded once. He carried his plate to the basin and left it there, unwashed. That, apparently, was understood to be my work, or at least the arrangement we were quietly feeling our way into. I stayed at the table a little longer than I needed to. I washed that plate before he was even up the next morning, though it hadn't needed doing that badly. Truth is, I'd lain in that narrow cot most of the night listening to the house settle around me, a beam creaking somewhere overhead, the wind finding some gap in the siding, and when sleep wouldn't come the rest of the way, I got up and lit the lamp low and stood at the basin with cold water and that one plate, just to have something to do with my hands. By the time he came through, boots already on, hat in hand, the plate was dry and stacked with the others. He looked at it without saying anything, then looked at the pot on the stove. I'd made coffee. He poured a cup and stood at the window while the light came up gray and still over the yard. "I'll need the flour from the lean-to," I said. He went and got it, set the sack on the table. For a second he was close enough that I noticed the seam of his collar, mended once, not perfectly. I filed it away without knowing why. "That's just the kind of thing I notice. I'll be framing the south wall today," he said, finishing his coffee standing up. "The boy'll come by to lift. Don't wait on me for the midday meal, I'll eat at noon out there." I nodded. He set his cup in the basin this time, not my work. His a small renegotiation I clocked without remarking on, and went out. I stood at the window and watched him cross the yard toward the half-built frame, the frost on the ground just starting to catch a thin silver from the coming sun. He walked the way a man walks when he already knows exactly where he's going and isn't trying to prove a thing about it. That's the truest picture I ever had of Sela's marrow, and it came to me on my second morning in that house, before he'd said more than a dozen sentences to me in a row. I made the bread the way my mother taught me, by feel more than by measuring, the dough cool and familiar under my hands even in a kitchen I didn't know yet. The oven needed learning, same as everything else did. Somewhere across the yard, hammering started up, even and unhurried, and I caught myself working to its rhythm without meaning to. The loaf came out risen unevenly. Oven ran hot on the left side, something to fix next time. I set it on the board to cool and looked at it plainly, the way my mother taught me to look at a finished thing honestly, without apologizing for it. The hammering stopped. I heard the pump handle in the yard, 2 pulls, then water, then boots on the step. He came in without knocking, his right in his own house, and washed at the basin with that same concentrated attention men give to small tasks they've repeated 10,000 times. He looked at the bread. "Looks different than yesterday," he said. "Oven pulls left, I'll know it next time." He nodded once and sat. I cut 2 slices, set them down. There was butter in a covered dish by the window, and he reached for it himself, which I appreciated more than I let on. I'd known before what it was to live with a person who expected everything handed to him, and I had no wish to know it again. "Frame on the east wall'll be done by Thursday," he said after a while. "After that we're waiting on lumber from Harland." "How long does that take?" 4 days. "Maybe 5. He looked at me then, not sharp, but with more attention than usual. "Depends on the road." I nodded and ate my bread and noticed a crack in the plaster above the window, branching like a little river system. Going nowhere in particular, and yet exactly where it had always been going. I'd been meaning to ask about it for days and kept not asking, because it wasn't my wall to ask about. He pushed back and stood, put his own plate in the basin, took his hat off the peg. "I'll be at the frame till the light goes." "I'll have something ready," I told him. He went out. I stood in the quiet he left behind, the bread cooling, that crack above the window branching and branching. And I felt, for the first time since stepping off that train, something that wasn't quite comfort, but was standing very close to it. The next 4 days changed something between us that neither of us was ready to name out loud yet. The first day, I worked through the mending basket and started cutting down a length of fabric I found folded in a chest by the door into curtains for my room. I never asked whose they'd been. I hemmed and hung them before supper. When he came in that evening, he looked once at the window, just once, and then looked away fast, and I understood I'd done something that called for acknowledgement he didn't yet know how to give. The second day, wind came up from the south carrying dust with it, and I wet a cloth and pressed it into the gap under the front door. He watched me from the porch without a word. Later I found an old rag stuffed in that same gap, older than I was, gray and half dissolved. I pulled it out, put my cloth in its place, and burned the old rag in the stove. The third day was quiet in a different way, the kind of quiet that settles after wind has scoured something clean. I washed the windows from the inside while a boy named Tobias, who'd taken to hanging around the build site, dragged a rag in uneven circles across the outside glass, humming something tuneless under his breath. I let him keep at it longer than it strictly needed. That evening, I walked out to the frame at dusk to call him in for supper. He was standing at the far end with a plumb line, watching it settle, the light gone low and amber, throwing the frame's shadow long across the dirt. He heard me and turned. "Supper," I said. He nodded, started winding the line around his hand in that slow, careful way he had with every tool. The way that told you the tool would be ready the next time he reached for it. Never hunted for. Never left tangled. "The windows," he said as I turned to go. I stopped. "They were—" He paused like he was deciding whether to finish the thought. "I noticed." I didn't turn around. "The light's better after," I said. "Yes," he said, that was all. I walked back and set the food out, and by the time he came in, I had my hands wrapped around my own cup and my face arranged back into its usual order. But something in the room had shifted its proportions, and I sat with that through the whole meal, the way you sit with whether that's turning, not alarmed, not sure of anything yet. Just aware the air was doing something new around us. 3 more days went by where nothing was said and nothing particularly needed to be. I cooked, he built. Tobias came and went between the two of us like something loose in the wind. A nail here, a question there, showing up at the table with sawdust on his collar that neither of us ever mentioned. In the evenings, I could hear the frame settling into itself, small creaks and shifts of wood adjusting to its own weight. And I found I'd started listening for those sounds the way you listen for the last of a storm passing. On the fourth day, the roofing started. I carried water out at mid-morning and stood at the base of the ladder, watching him move across the skeleton of the roof against a flat white sky, careful, unhurried. Each step placed only after the last one had proven itself. I set the tin cup on a sawbuck and went back inside. An hour later, when I came out again, the cup was empty and he was back on the ground, kneeling beside a length of timber, marking it with chalk. I picked up the cup without looking at him. He spoke without looking up from his measuring. "You could use that corner room," he said, "when it's done if you wanted it for the work." I stopped. He meant the mending. He'd seen me at the table, by the window, the angle of the light, the way I positioned the cloth, the hours I kept at it after supper. He'd been noticing that longer than I'd realized. "You'd have the light till mid-afternoon," he said, "west-facing." He chalked a second mark and stood, lifting the timber. "I'll think on it," I said. He nodded and carried the timber off toward the frame. I stood there a moment with the tin cup in my hand. The sky overhead was very blue and very still. A hawk made one slow circle above the ridge, and then it was gone, and something about watching it go made my chest ache in a way I couldn't have explained to anybody. That evening I set a lamp on the table in that corner room, not to use it, just to see. The light fell in a long, pale rectangle across the floor, and I stood in the doorway watching it a while before I went back to the kitchen. I didn't say a word about the lamp. In the morning it was still burning, the wick down low, the glass faintly warm under my hand. I trimmed it and set it back, then went to make coffee. When he came in from checking the frame, I had 2 cups on the counter, and I was looking out at the yard, at the light just starting to come up over the eastern edge of the ridge. Neither of us said a single word about the lamp, or the room, or the shape the morning had quietly taken on around us. And somehow that silence was the most settled thing in the whole house. If you told me on that train platform, watching my own hand shadow across the dirt street of a town I'd never seen, that I'd end up learning to cut a mortise joint before the first snow, I'd have laughed you off the porch. But that's exactly where this story was headed, and I didn't see it coming any more than you probably do right now. The frame was nearly done. He said it plain one morning over coffee, no ceremony to it at all. "Frame's nearly done." And I heard something in those 4 words that wasn't only about lumber. "What comes after the frame?" I asked. "The walls," he said. I nodded like that settled something and went about my morning. The days had taken on a shape by then, one neither of us had planned. Coffee when he came in. The quiet before the work pulled us apart for the day. That hour in the evening when the light went gold and the tools finally went silent, and we'd sit on opposite sides of the table, my mending in my lap, his pencil scratching across paper, and the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of things neither one of us had reached for yet. I'd noticed the loose board on the second step 3 days before and said nothing about it. The next morning it was fixed. I never heard him do it. I only stepped on it and felt it hold and understood. That was how it worked between us, noticing, and then the thing simply done, no explanation offered on either end, none needed. There was a woman at the general store, Mrs. Yeager, the one behind the counter that first day, who watched me a beat longer than necessary every time I came in for flour or lamp oil. The way a person watches when they're composing a question they've decided not to ask yet. I let her watch. I carried my things home and offered her nothing. The town had opinions, towns always do. I'd known that from the platform on, and I'd made my peace with it the way I made peace with most things, not by settling it, but by deciding it didn't deserve my attention. What deserved my attention was the mortise joint he showed me one afternoon on the northwest corner of the frame. The wood seated so cleanly you could barely find the seam. He didn't say a word about it, just let me look. I ran my thumb along the join and felt how tight it held, and something in my chest did a quiet thing I didn't try to name. That evening, he stayed at the table longer than usual. I was near the window mending a shirt, the candle burning low between us, aware of him the way you become aware of weather, not watching for it, just knowing it's there. At some point I looked up and found him already looking at me. He didn't look away, I didn't either. Then he dropped his eyes back to his paper, and I dropped mine back to my needle, and the candle kept burning between us in that quiet room. The next morning I was up before him, which hadn't happened yet. I had the fire going and the coffee on, and honestly couldn't tell you why I'd woken at that hour, except that sleep had simply stopped holding on to me. I stood at the window while the water heated. The town was still dark at its edges, one lamp burning down at the livery, a thin coat of frost on the ground that would be gone by 9. I heard him on the stairs, that particular weight and rhythm I'd learned without ever meaning to learn it, and turned back to the stove. He stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything about my being up early or the coffee already poured. He just came in, sat, wrapped both hands around the cup. I sat across from him. Neither of us spoke for a while. The fire worked at the cold. The winter frame needs sealing before the first hard freeze, he finally said. How long? 10 days if the weather holds. Maybe 8. I looked down at the cup in my hands. Something in that accounting, 8 days, 10 days, sat differently in my chest than I expected it to. I'd always been good at the arithmetic of leaving, how much I had, how far it would carry me, how long before I had to decide. I ran those numbers without even thinking about it, the way some people check a door locked twice before bed. It wasn't fear exactly. Just the habit of a woman who'd taught herself not to be surprised by endings anymore. 8 days. I set the cup down. Outside, a crow called once and went quiet. He was watching me in that way of his, not pressing, not waiting on anything in particular. Just present and patient the way a man gets when he's learned the cost of rushing things that don't want to be rushed. I'd noticed that about him early on, he never asked a question twice. The northwest corner, I said. The joint you showed me. What about it? I want to learn to cut one. He was quiet a second, then he nodded just once, and that was that. I picked my cup back up, and the conversation moved on to the day's work, and after that there was no more talking. Only the two of us and the fire, and the slow gray brightening at the window that meant morning was coming, whether either of us was ready for it or not. He showed me right after breakfast when the light was good for it. 2 short scraps of pine on the workbench, no ceremony to the lesson at all. This face, this angle, the depth of the cheek. He handed me the saw and watched where I set my thumb to guide the first stroke. I cut too steep the first try. He didn't say a word, just reached past me and nudged the wood 2 fingers width without touching my hands at all. I tried again, closer, not right but closer. I could feel exactly where the error lived before I even lifted the saw. Some shift in pressure right at the end of the stroke. A small impatience in my wrist that I hadn't noticed I carried until that moment. You're rushing the last inch, he said. I picked the saw back up and cut again. This time when the piece came free, I pressed the 2 halves together and there was still a hairline gap at the heel, thin, but there. He looked at it, then picked up his own saw and showed me the last inch again. That slow, almost reluctant drag of the blade, like the wood needed time to agree to being cut. I watched his shoulder that time, not his hands. The way the effort spread out even and patient the whole way through the stroke. I tried it once more on a fresh piece, the joint seated. I didn't say anything, just pressed the faces together, felt them hold and set it on the bench. He picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. That was the whole of his praise, and somehow it was enough. A girl named Ruth came by at midday with bread wrapped in cloth from the boarding house where she helped her aunt. She stood in the doorway, looked at the workbench, then at the 2 of us and said it was getting big. It is, he said. Going to be the nicest house in town, she said. Low bar, he said, and she laughed, bright and sudden, the way children laugh when they catch a grown-up being funny without meaning to. She set the bread on a crate by the door and left. I found myself still looking at the doorway after she'd gone. Something about that laugh had opened up a small space in my chest that I didn't examine too closely. The next morning the bread was on the crate again before we'd even arrived. Ruth must have come by early. He looked at it a beat too long. I set it on the higher shelf out of the dust, and we started in on the day. Around mid-morning I went to fetch it and found, tucked under the cloth, a small jar of something dark. Preserves of some kind, the lid sealed with wax. No note. I didn't know what to do with the feeling that gave me, so I set the jar carefully next to the bread and went back to sanding the stair rail. He noticed it when he passed by for water. She must like you, he said. She doesn't know me, I said. She knows you're here every day, he said. and went on to fill his cup, and I turned that over in my head without answering it out loud. Outside, a wagon passed, the driver calling something to somebody across the street. Ordinary sounds, the town going about the business of being a town. He picked up the stair rail section I'd been working and fitted it against the newel post. It seated clean. He checked the angle with a square, and I watched the level bubble settle and hold still. "That's right," he said. I'd worked the calculation out myself the night before by lamplight from measurements I'd carried in my head all day. I didn't tell him that. He moved on to the next section. I picked the sandpaper back up and kept at it, my back to the window, light falling across the grain in long, even lines. And somewhere behind the wall, a branch scraped the new siding in the wind, steady, unhurried, like something settling into place for good. The build finished on a Thursday. I knew it before he said a word, just from how the morning moved differently, slower, with more air in it somehow. He walked every room once, checking corners, running a hand along the new post, the window casings, the threshold plate. I followed a half-step behind, watching his hands. They found nothing to correct. He stood a long time in the front room without speaking. Light came in off the street and crossed the new floor in one clean, pale bar and just held there. "Good work," he said. I didn't say anything back. There wasn't anything left to add. We packed the tools the same way we'd unpacked them. Planes first, then the spoke shave and the brace, then the saws laid flat on a bed of clean rag. I'd learned the order without ever being taught it and followed it now without being told. When the last clasp snapped shut, he set the crate near the door and didn't lift it right away. I was standing at the window, not looking out particularly, just standing where the light happened to be. "The Whitcomb place starts in a month," he said. "Footing, framing, the full run." He paused. I could use a hand who knows the work. It was said plain. It asked nothing I didn't already have a clear answer for. That was just how he did things, offered them level, gave you room to say no, and then waited without filling up the silence himself. I looked down at the floor we'd laid together, board by board, chalk line and mallet, the grain running south toward the light. I'd learned that floor. I knew the exact sound each board made under a plane. "All right," I said. He picked up the crate. I got the door. We crossed the street together in the late morning while the town went on about its business around us. A cart outside the dry goods, 2 women talking near the post office steps. A dog asleep in the shade of the delivery wall. Nobody was watching. Nobody needed to be. At the corner, he set the crate down to adjust his grip, and I'd already reached down and taken the other handle before he could ask. He looked at me once. I looked straight ahead. We carried it together to the wagon, lifted it over the board, set it in. He climbed up to the bench. I climbed up beside him. The horse stood still until he gathered the reins, and then it moved off easy, no hurry to it, out past the last storefront where the street gave way to open road. And the sky came down wide and pale on both sides, and the town fell back behind us and didn't call us back. The wheel ruts ran dry and straight under us, and the morning wasn't over yet. It was just getting started, same as everything else between us. I think about that ride out of Wendell more than almost anything else in my life, not because anything dramatic happened on it. Nothing did. But because it was the first time I understood that a life built quietly, board by board, joint by honest joint. With a man who never asked a question twice, and never once needed you to be anything other than exactly what you were. That kind of life could hold weight the same way that house held its own. I didn't have a word for what we were to each other yet. I'm not sure either of us needed one for a good while longer. But I knew, riding back out toward that house with the sun climbing behind us, that I wasn't counting days anymore. I'd stopped somewhere around the 8th one, without even noticing I had. So here's what I want to ask you. If you'd stepped off that train, one bag in your hand and a 4-month-old letter in your pocket, not knowing if you were walking toward a home or just another kind of nowhere, would you have stayed past the first supper? Would you have let yourself notice the folded towel, the mended collar, the loose step fixed without a word? Or would you have kept your bag packed just in case? Tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and tell me honestly, would you have stayed? If this one found its way into your chest the way it found its way into mine, do me a favor and hit like, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave your answer down in the comments. I read every single one,